me to introduce you to the most electrifying
podcast.
Oh my God!
Okay, let's just jump into things. Is this our second official episode of WWE?
Oh my God, it is.
Wrestling with
It is officially the second podcast of WWN Wrestling with Narrative.
That's great. It took us a long time, but here we are. Okay, so what are we going to be covering today? Just jumping right into things. From last week,
Okay.
we did what, the 80s?
Last week we covered the American hero in wrestling in the 1980s. And, we kind of looked at a little bit we looked at politics, at life during the 1980s, all in relationship with the biggest star of the 1980s, which was Hulk Hogan, right?
Yep.
And what he represented to the people at the time, especially wrestling fans, right? Because he was like the biggest star of that era. And now we're going to look a little bit at the 90s.
All right.
And the 90s are a very confusing time. There was a huge transition here in the wrestling world between the 80s and the 1990s. So we're just going to discuss all the different factors of it and like all the important characters and important wrestlers and not just wrestlers, but companies that played an important role in that.
Righto. All right. So I think last week we talked about Hogan ended up dropping the belt in, was it 94? Does that sound right to you? I kind of don't remember my dates exactly.
Yeah, I believe he dropped the belt somewhere in the early 90s. I don't know if it was 94. I don't know if Hulk Hogan dropped the belt in 94 exactly. I can't remember what date it was.
No, yeah, it wasn't.
But
I'm confusing
he did.
things. It looks like he dropped it in, did it? 89 to Ultimate War. No, 90 to Ultimate Warrior, right? So Ultimate Warrior was technically our first champion of the 90s, and that was WrestleMania 6. Yep.
That's right. Yeah.
And it was a title versus title match, Intercontinental. So he ended up holding both of the belts for a little while, huh? It's kind of nuts.
Yeah. That was, I guess, a passing of the torch moment, I would say. I think that's what the idea was. Hogan had ruled the 1980s, and then they saw Warrior possibly as the next guy who was going to step up and be the face of the company now. So Hogan drops the belt, which, as you know, is pretty insane because this was also the reign. Like if you think about title reigns in the WWF, WWE now, this has to be one of the most historic title reigns of all time. Hogan was champion for, what was it, 1,500, like a ridiculous amount of days.
It was close to 1,500 days. It was like just a month shy, like 26 days shy of 1,500 days, which is nuts. But I think you mentioned it last time too. Like he lost the belt to Andre, and then there was some shenanigans with Ted DiBiase. Then Randy Savage ended up getting it because he beat Ted DiBiase, and then Hogan got it back.
Randy was champ.
Yeah,
Hogan got it back. That was the whole. They had the Mega Power storyline. That was the Mega Power storyline with Miss Elizabeth. And there was that whole, like, Randy was jealous that he thought that Hogan had, like, an affair with Miss Elizabeth or something. And that was sort of, like, the storyline behind that WrestleMania and that match.
Right.
But...
then Warrior comes along. And just, like, pushing forward through the history. We don't want to get too stuck in the minutia here, I think. Warrior comes along. He drops it to Slaughter. Who could also be considered like an interim champion because he only held it for 2 months, and then Hogan gets it back in 91. So it's not really like he was winding down at this point, right? Hulkamania and Hulk Hogan being on top wasn't really over yet. Taker gets it for like a week, and then Hogan gets it back for 1 day. And then it's vacated. Whatever.
I think it was 93. I think it was I think he vacated the belt in 93. So you were close. I think Hogan officially sort of vacated the belt in 1993.
Yeah.
Because he returns to New Japan in that year.
Did he really go back to New Japan? I didn't know.
Yeah, for like a little tiny while, which is a little shocking to me. He wrestled Muda over there, which is incredible.
I remember seeing that match. Yeah, it was a very strange match because Hogan was actually technical.
Right. That's so weird, right? Because it was like he totally doesn't have to do this anymore, right? Like he's already a megastar. He's got to be rich beyond his wildest dreams. He doesn't have to go all the way to Japan and actually like wrestle a strong style technical match against legitimate badasses. Like he doesn't have to do that.
I remember watching an interview of Hogan actually shooting on that match, and he said he was nervous because he's like, come on, guys, I'm not really a technical wrestler, and you expect so much from the wrestling, so I kind of like had to pull out all the submission holds and stuff, and the match was okay. Like it was pretty good for a Hogan match, especially late 80s, early 90s style Hogan. So then
it's pretty insane. Yeah, it's like But you know what's interesting?
What's that?
Yeah. No, I was basically gonna switch. I was switching gears too, actually, because I was going to say that okay, so it's 93. Hogan leaves WWE, and I guess there's a void now as to who's going to be the new face of the wrestling world. Which at the time, the face of the wrestling world was synonymous with the WWE. I mean, the WWE had already pretty much dominated the market share, the market space completely. And then, but of course, WCW was just around the corner. It was actually
WCW actually begin? Like, when was the first?
That was 90 of Nitro, or as a company itself?
As a company itself, it looks like
It should have
95 broadcast.
It should.
Yeah.
No, it was before that.
Nitro. It says here. It says Nitro started its broadcast in 1995.
Yeah, it probably started in 95, but as a company, it was before that.
Yeah, 88.
It was a little before that.
Apparently started it, where he kind of like bought up Jim Crockett Promotions, apparently.
Yeah, it was Jim Crockett. It was the Jim. Yeah, that's what it was. Because that was basically billionaire Ted buying the territory and saying, okay, we're going to do big things now because we've got the billions to like go out and buy all the best talent.
Billions.
Kind of a little bit like stuff that's going on right now in wrestling a little bit. Not so much with, buying territories, but with billionaires starting their own wrestling companies.
So we're seeing a big change here, right? Because up until this point, Vince had been sort of buying out all of the little territories, right? He started his empire. He was buying everybody out. They were the de facto major face of professional wrestling. And then in the 90s, Hogan's winding down. He leaves. So that leaves a vacuum, right? And
that's right.
So what we really want to talk about today, the theme that we're talking about today, is the kind of counterculture and anti-establishment / anti-hero gimmick that was born from this era. And whether or not that was created because Hogan left or not, I don't want to make that argument, but maybe a little bit in part to that, but also just the culture in general, I think, was moving towards that trend, right?
Right. I think it was moving towards that trend. And, I think the events of the 1980s in terms of the WWE being sort of the company of companies, just Vince Jr. buying all the territories and basically creating one giant, company, and then having one guy to rule them all, which was Hogan, having, I think the blowback from that starts to come in this decade, right? Because then you have people who are thinking, okay, like, is this what we want to really watch? Is this all that we want to see on television? Is just this guy, and the American hero guy? And I think that starts to the seeds had already been sort of planted here for people wanting something that was an alternative or something that was going up against like the giant mega corporation. So
sure. So we
I think
talked
that played a
before
role there.
we talked before about the role, and it's kind of unavoidable. We have to talk about these two characters because of, well, one, they're just massive popularity in terms of wrestling. Maybe not as big as Hogan, but they were really important. And then the two different sides of, face, heel, and how they interacted with each other in the ring and outside of the ring. And of course, we're talking about Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. So I describe them as sides of the same coin. And I believe that the two of them together, kind of took over the role that Hogan had left. And they passed the belt back and forth a couple of times. And there was a few more guys in the mix, right? Like there was Diesel, there was Psycho Sid, Undertaker.
Psycho Sid.
But
Undertaker,
for the most part, through the mid to mid 90s, early mid 90s, it was these two guys, right? Hart and Michaels.
Yeah, that's basically, those two guys sort of became the focus. And I think they both represented different things that maybe were appealing to Vince. I mean, Hogan leaves and let's just sort of like talk a little bit about the void that Hogan left, right? Because Hogan leaves in 93. He joins WCW in 1994. So 94 he joins WCW, and that was a big thing. They did like a whole parade and like in like Florida or something. There was like a Disney parade for his big it was ridiculous. I remember this on television, not watching it years after it happened because I was probably like 4 years old when this happened. But I remember how big this was, man. Like this was a huge deal because Hogan was the biggest wrestling star that had ever lived up until that point.
Right. And he had just jumped ship to the competition, right? So of course they're going to make a lot of fanfare about it.
He had just jumped ship. So a couple things before we even jump into the Bret Shawn stuff. You have this happening, but there's another thing that's going on as well. I believe it was 93 when we have the creation of something called Eastern Championship Wrestling, which is ECW, that will later be changed to Extreme Championship Wrestling.
Yes.
And this is super important to this narrative, right? Because this was, I mean, if you're going to talk about alternatives here, this was like completely different from any type of packaging that the WWF was at the time. This was bringing in a whole different type of wrestling crowd completely.
And when it was Eastern Championship Wrestling, you sent me that link to the that documentary, right? We learned that Eastern Championship Wrestling was kind of like a really we'll say substandard wrestling promotion at the time, right? Like there was nothing special about it. It was just kind of one of these hokey regional ones. And then Paulie Dangerously, or Paulie D, or Paulie whatever.
Beautiful old Paul Heyman.
He comes in and he really shakes things up. And I don't really remember, how did they make that transition from going Eastern Championship to just insane bloodbath matches? Like these
because eventually, because what happened was ECW started off as an offshoot of the NWA. So that was the original plan. The original plan was to basically design ECW as an offshoot of the NWA. But with Paul Heyman under the mix, the matches had already, there was a different vibe in the air. Like they had already acquired like Sabu, they had already acquired Sandman. They already had these early ECW guys who were doing like bloody matches. They had all the extreme guys. And what happened was, I believe it was Shane Douglas. He was the champ.
Yeah.
And he was going to be crowned the first ECW champ, and he was going to hoist up the NWA belt. Like the same, like that really iconic NWA Ric Flair belt. And he drops it on the floor.
The huge golden belt.
And he drops it on the floor and hoists up the ECW belt. And he basically says something along the lines of like, I can't remember what exactly it was that he said after the match when he won, but it was basically like, fuck NWA, screw them. we are, long live ECW. That was the thing. And then after that, they changed it to Extreme Championship Wrestling, because which is kind of crazy at the time, but they decided to move away completely from those NWA roots, which they could have stick to, because the NWA was this huge, promotion that had so much history, and they didn't want to do that. They just wanted to create their own thing,
Sure. So that was, I'm looking at the dates here, and that was in 1994. So if we're going to compare the two at this time, 94 was Brett, right? Brett was the champion. And he won it in WrestleMania 10, apparently from Yokozuna. And this was not the one. This was not the one where Hogan comes in, right? That was the last WrestleMania where Hogan came in immediately afterwards and basically just took the belt.
That was the one before.
Yeah.
That's the one. That's the one with Yokozuna and all that. Yeah. Oh my God. Beautiful times.
Right. So we have the birth of this counterculture brand, right? That's the other buzzword that we're trying to address in this episode. So things are changing, right?
They are changing.
Smaller guys are getting more popular. I mean, Brett and Sean, they're like, 6'1", so they're not really small dudes, because they're still huge and muscular. But compared to the 6'6" and the 6'8" Undertakers and these giant guys, they're
Hogan
And
these guys are 6 feet, 200 pounds, maybe, very, very, very good, much better wrestlers, but certainly smaller. They're not these enormous roided beasts, and mind you, to just, go back a little bit to our previous cast, we had talked about the steroid scandal. So perhaps a big reason why they did initially want to push, and remember, Ric Flair was in the WWE at the time as well. This was the beginning of the 90s. Ric Flair was there. You look at Rick, you look at Brett, you look at Sean, smaller guys. Maybe there is a post-steroid scandal reason why they decided to go with guys that were not as juiced up, just to kind of get the feds off their back, not get that kind of attention, and not put some enormous monster in the mix,
That's a good point, actually. And I think great, right? Because Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, two of my favorite wrestlers, and I think they're like an early Mark's favorite wrestler too, along with Ric Flair, right? Because those guys put on some incredible barn burner matches against each other, and just in general, right? If you liked wrestling for wrestling, oh my God, I still believe that there's nothing like Shawn Michaels in his prime, even if he was a total douchebag, as a human. His matches were absolutely incredible. Amazing crowd control, just the charisma, the showboating, and then the in-ring ability of this guy. He's my favorite wrestler for a reason.
We'll never. Yeah, you're definitely for the listeners out there, Jack is the ultimate Shawn Michaels mark. It's his all-time favorite wrestler. Definitely. But you are raising a very interesting point here, right? It's interesting because talking about the American hero a little bit, we have this new thing where we have really talented wrestlers that are getting the top spots, or they're getting their big pushes. Now with Brett and with Sean, they're in the plans to become possibly the next stars of the company now that Hogan is gone. Right. And I think there's an appreciation for what they can do in the ring, for their actual work rate, for their technical ability, for their storytelling ability. That's just a very different type of narrative that's getting played out now, because those are things that you never really asked with Hogan. You never really said wow, that guy has he's so good and technical, and his way, he knows how to just play the ring psychology. That's not initially what Hogan was about. It was just more of, this guy is larger than life, and that's it. But now you have this wrestling fan really talking about, what about their wrestling? Are they good? Can they put on matches? And
you know what?
while
I'm
this
gonna challenge
conversation
you
is
there for a
happening,
second. I'm gonna challenge you there for a
okay,
second. I don't know if the fans were actually thinking that or not. And it's kind of hard
but
to look back on that and say yes or no, right? Because
maybe not too much, but think about this. Maybe at that very moment, the wrestling fan wasn't really thinking too much about the technical ability or the work rate per se. Maybe not in exactly 1993 or 1994, but those wrestling fans that were assisting the that were going to ECW shows, and the ones that were, you know, starting to become a little bit more aware. I mean, and we're talking about the underground people here, the people that are real wrestling nerds, the early wrestling nerds of the early 90s. Like, this is a very small portion of the wrestling fan base at this given time. They're starting to grow, and they're starting to see this, you know what I mean? And I think this is going to be more important later on, is what I'm saying. This is going to evolve.
sure, okay. Sure. I'm going to venture out on a limb there and say that neither Brett nor Shawn Michaels could really be considered the face of the WWE or the face of wrestling in general, right? They were both
Ooh.
big in the WWE, but neither of them, I think, found Brett maybe more so because he was kind of a Canadian national hero. But
Right.
Shawn was never really. He was never Hogan. He never appeared on the talk shows and was probably a household name the way that Hogan was. And Brett may have been so, but only north of the border, I would reckon. Right?
Yeah.
So to me,
Yeah.
these two guys were still kind of placeholder champions. They kept the company afloat because they were super good at what they did. And as you say, the seeds had started to kind of sprout from the fans wanting something different, wanting that more wrestling based. Like, wow, these guys can really wrestle their butts off. Like, we like that. And they answered that call, but it wasn't enough, I would say.
No.
It wasn't
No,
enough.
it definitely wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. I mean, you had certain things. There were certain limitations there. I think, for example, with Shawn, Shawn had. I mean, do I think he could have been a star? I mean, not that he wasn't a star. He was, but why at the time he didn't become, let's say, a household name the way that Hogan was? You know, he had qualities in the sense of he was a good-looking guy. He had a look. Maybe he didn't fit the mold of being a 6'6" giant, but he was still a handsome guy. Had a look that could definitely transcend for that. But he was also a heel in a lot of situations. He would be a face, he would be a heel. So there was that whole thing, you know. And with Brett there's the fact that he's a great wrestler. He was the most famous Canadian for like the longest time. But you know, the thing is, like, it's a little hard here in the United States to make your number one face, the face of the whole company, and the poster child of your company, a Canadian guy,
right?
You know, in the United States, and there's gonna be a little difficulty there.
Do you want to talk a little
Especially
bit
when,
about? Sorry. Do you want to talk a little bit about
yeah,
how,
go
like,
for it.
Brett's face of how he was a face and how when he was a heel he was still actually a face? Because we had talked about this earlier, and I thought it was kind of interesting, right?
It's very fascinating. Yeah.
Right, like this whole.
Let's talk
What
about
was
it.
the documentary? Wrestling with Shadows. That's the big famous one where they follow him
Yeah,
around.
this is like required viewing for like Smarks. This is like Internet Marks 101. Like, you have to watch this thing. Yeah, absolutely. This is a very interesting, but for a reason it's so famous, and it's because you know, the interesting thing about Brett is the weird position that he's in. You know, he's in such a strange position. We're in the 90s because, you know, it's show business. That's what wrestling has become. But he comes from like this super, like, historic and celebrated Canadian wrestling family, probably the most celebrated Canadian wrestling family ever. And it's you know, he's kind of an old school guy in thinking, where for him it's about honor and it's about being strong, and he kind of
Doing the
clashes a
right
lot.
thing, right? He wants
Doing the right thing. That's right.
I kind of got the impression from watching that documentary that Bret Hart sort of missed the memo on that the whole thing is a work. And like he kind of comes off as like actually believing that the wrestling, I mean, not really. Obviously he knows it's a job, but like part
it's
of him
a work.
I kind of feel
he
like
it's a work.
really like he's so invested in it. He seems so how could I say sincere about him being a face, and he's genuinely upset when he has to play the role of a heel just because he's Canadian.
Heel.
You know, he's like, I don't want to be a heel, but I'm doing it because it's business. But this is bull, man. Like, why do these people hate me just because I'm Canadian? Like, and I kind of like that about him. You know, like he seems like a man from a different era, and
he's a man from a different era. And I think if you look at him in particular, he's one of those rare dying breeds who came from a lineage of pioneer wrestlers, or guys who had a shoot style of wrestling in the early 20th century. He was carrying over a lot of the ethics and ideals that his father had, being a tough guy, being strong, he was sort of the last vestiges of that. And it wasn't just him, but I'm sure, if you look at Owen was probably the same way. Carried a lot of that pride for his family, for his country, being in, this whole integrity thing was very big, right?
Sure, integrity. That's
doing
a
what was.
word. Yeah.
Here's what's fascinating about this whole situation. Here's what's really interesting with Bret. Bret has all these qualities of a good guy, right?
Yes.
Strength, honor. If you think about it, ultimately what Bret stands for is not that different from what Hogan stands for.
I'm glad
the original
you touched upon
Hogan,
this because I wanted to talk about this too. Yeah,
Hogan
I completely
is not.
agree.
Hogan stands for basically the same things. Now, I don't want to harp too much on Hogan here because we're sort of passing on to other things. But Hogan in the '80s was more or less honor, integrity, doing the right thing, et cetera, et cetera. But as we saw with Hogan, he started to taper off. So here we have Bret, stands for the same things. He is, and I guess you could say, well, okay, he was kind of a heel, and he was eventually treated as one. He eventually was getting booked as a heel, and he was being written into matches as a heel eventually. Sure. But I do want to do a little character
interesting thing, right? Here's another interesting thing about that character, as you said, right? He is the natural continuation of the good guy hero archetype, and he was still popular. And then we have Shawn Michaels, who there's no way you can categorize Shawn Michaels in the 90s as anything other than kind of an anti-hero and certainly at the very least like a trickster kind of roguish hero, right? Like he's
definitely a roguish hero.
He was, as you said, handsome, athletic, really good at what he did, but he was sort of a dick. And people liked it. Like people started eating it up. And I think that's an important turning point here because we had these two characters, the traditional hero who was still popular, but his popularity began waning. And this other guy who was like, ooh, okay, he's a little bit edgy. He's a little bit different from what we're used to, but I kind of like it. And I think that also plays into this developing counterculture thing that we were seeing with ECW and eventually in WWE or WWF at the time, right? And I think this might be a good point to kind of again shift gears and talk about what we had mentioned, off air is probably the real turning point in WWF when they fully embraced that anti-establishment, anti-hero character fully, put him as the face of the company, and people ate it up. And of course, we're talking about now Stone Cold Steve Austin.
Yeah, this was the big one, right? So Austin was the big sort of character to come. But as you mentioned, before Austin became Stone Cold, right? There were already anti-establishment characters that had been developing to very little success. As you mentioned with Sean, for example, a trickster, kind of a roguish character, very tongue-in-cheek, never quite a super mega baby face, but nonetheless one of the top guys, especially in those early, WrestleMania 12. He wins the belt, WrestleMania, he definitely was one of the top guys. And also keep in mind that if we're going to talk about Stone Cold, we have to talk about sort of how he became eventually the Texas Rattlesnake, how he actually became that guy. And unquestionably, that energy that he bought, he developed a lot of that from ECW when he was there for his short tenure, because he came from WCW.
Right.
He's in WCW, Hollywood Blondes. He is, and again, I'll bring that up later because I do think this all ties in, but he is a great technical wrestler in WCW with Brian Pillman. The Hollywood Blondes are a really good tag team and stuff. But what happens is he goes over to ECW, kind of disgruntled because the company wanted to let him go. He got an injury in Japan, so WCW canned him. Goes to ECW, and he starts cutting those promos. He starts cutting those Steve-A-Mania promos on ECW.
Right, the mocking Hogan just outright.
Mocking Hogan. What were your thoughts on what were your thoughts on that? Because it's kind of interesting thinking of Austin in retrospect as like this megastar and seeing sort of like the early development of that.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting. I'm always really curious looking back on the prototype characters of these megastars, as you say, the guys that we know now or that we look back at and consider legends. It's very curious, right? I think that's that was probably a really great time for him to experiment and kind of develop his own personality within the ring. I've mentioned this to you before, I think, but
Okay.
in my personal opinion, the recipe for success when it comes to building one of these great characters is to let the wrestler manifest themselves genuinely. Wrestling with Narrative, people.